Have you ever wondered why the standards of modern art have pretty much gone to shit? Why art is, in many cases nowadays, flat out hideous? Have you ever wondered why obesity is no longer a negative trait to be avoided or overcome, but is now outright lauded? Have you ever wondered why the word woman is so difficult to define nowadays? Have you ever wondered why homosexuals will protest for an Islamic extremist organization which murders homosexuals and yet see no irony in that? Have you ever wondered why in some locales crime is not only not punished but actively fostered? Well, such are the fruits of postmodernism. And if you would like to know how the seeds which became those fruits were sown, then have I got the book for you. That book would be Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks. Now, this is a book which I would truly aver is inestimably valuable to this present day and age in which we live, because I think it really grapples with the issues which face us and also sees through those issues to what really lies behind them, and quite astutely at that, I would say. And for that, it is a book which I believe is of great pertinence and value. So Stephen Hicks is a professor of philosophy, and his aim with this book is, as its title might indicate, to explain postmodernism, to explain its roots and history, but also to explain the political aspect of it. Because the thing about postmodernism is that it has a pronounced political element to it, in particular a decidedly left-wing element. And so Stephen Hicks undertook with this book to try to get to the heart of these matters and to see how they tie together, as well as to illuminate what it is that drives these things behind the scenes, so to speak. And I have to say, I think he did quite the bang-up job of it. So Hicks starts off his book with the Enlightenment, the age of reason. That is very important. And Hicks's thesis is that the Enlightenment was a very good thing, because the Enlightenment led to the development of the concept of individualism. Hicks would posit, and I would wholeheartedly second, that this is probably the noblest development in human history. The belief that every person's life is sacred, that every person's life is a moral end in itself, that our lives as individuals have meaning in themselves alone, that we are not just throwaway cogs in some grand societal machine, that we do not exist merely for the service of the state, but that we are, again, moral ends in ourselves. Subsequently, notions such as representative and limited government arose, a shift away from the belief that government exists to corral people into conformity, but rather to defend the rights of the individual so that they may direct their own course, so that they may, to allude to a certain famous Enlightenment era document, pursue their own happiness, as is their right. Now, another notion which the Enlightenment gave us is, of course, that of reason. The belief that we as people can know things about our world and make judgments based off our inputs, and thus navigate our world accordingly. These concepts, Hicks asserts, really burgeoned with figures such as John Locke and Adam Smith. But in the very midst of the Enlightenment, Hicks says that another movement arose, which he refers to as the counter-Enlightenment, which, he says, was helmed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, what's interesting about Rousseau is how he basically pushed back against all of the core tenets of the Enlightenment. As Hicks illustrates in the book, using Rousseau's own words, he recoiled from reason itself because he viewed reason as being the foundation of higher human civilization, the force that pulled man away from his basic natural state of equality and gave rise to concepts such as property and inequality between people. Consequently, our passions are surer guides than our reason. That is, the heart is a better guide than the head. And also, Rousseau believed that the individual wasn't really worth all that much, that the general will trumps all. Thus, we see the push for collectivism and the necessity of the state. Now, Rousseau initially, and rightly I would say, was pretty much run out of town, so to speak, because of how radical his views were at the time. But alas, those views eventually caught on, and they went on to influence other thinkers such as Immanuel Kant. And it is with Kant, Hicks says, that the trouble really started. So, in his critique of pure reason, which I have read because I'm about that life, Kant divided reality into two zones, the noumenal and the phenomenal. And he posited that we as humans can only ever have knowledge of phenomenal reality, not noumenal ultimate reality, not reality as it truly is. In so doing, Kant basically asserted that when you get right down to it, reason isn't really worth a whole lot, that it doesn't truly hold water. And this, Hicks says, was a watershed moment because it basically destroyed classical epistemology. What Kant did was essentially to open a breach between ourselves and the world we inhabit, a breach through which all manner of tomfoolery subsequently marched. Because if we cannot say anything objectively about reality, then it's pretty much fair game for anyone with an agenda to jump in and argue their subjective say for what that reality actually is, which many have since done. And also, Hicks highlights some of Kant's political writings, which I wasn't really familiar with. I mean, I've only read the Critique of Pure Reason. I wasn't really overly familiar with Kant's more political beliefs. But yeah, they're pretty horrifying. Hicks quotes Kant as talking about how man is a creature who needs a master and how the state exists to force the populace into correct behavior and such. And he also talks about how war is, contrary to the negative thing most people probably view it as, is actually a positive occurrence through which nature perfects her human experiments via bloodshed and carnage. Yeah, it's frankly awful, and it really started to lower my estimation of Kant as a thinker. But anyway, from Kant, we then come to Hegel, who was a student of Kant's thought. And this is where things really start to drop off, because everybody who is even passingly familiar with Hegel's work will know that Hegel has a reputation for having written some of the most inscrutable gibberish ever penned, because Hegel was basically widening the gap that Kant had created between humans and their world. You may have heard beyond good and evil, but Hegel was really going beyond logic itself, because as Hicks illustrates with quotations of Hegel was making statements that by the terms of classical Aristotelian logic are basically nonsensical. But like Back to the Future, logic, where we're going, we don't need logic. So not only did Hegel posit lots of incredibly speculative theories about things, but he also doubled down on Kant's authoritarian political views and literally said that people should worship the state as a terrestrial divinity, that the state is literally an extension of God in the world, and that if you are called upon by the state to die, then it is your duty to die simply because others deem it fit that you do so. And reading that, my reaction to that was like, who the hell died and made you God to say such shit? Like, where are you deriving the authority to make these horseshit pronouncements? Now, Hegel's philosophy led to a split into two different camps after him, the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians, the latter of which Karl Marx was a notable member of. What this really resulted in, though, was a diffusion into right-wing collectivist movements like fascism, National Socialism, and left-wing collectivist movements such as socialism and Marxism. Ideologies that, although seemingly on the opposite ends of the spectrum, were both united by certain key themes, such as the subordination of the individual to the state or the collective. Eventually, though, we come to Heidegger, a philosopher of the 20th century who, as a close associate of the Nazi Party, was a notable right wing collectivist, but who also served to further destroy reason by taking things even farther beyond conventional logic than Hegel. Like Heidegger's work is notorious for being so abstruse that to the eye of the average person, no real sense can even probably be parsed from it. But now, while right wing collectivism can be said to have developed around racial and nationalistic lines, left wing collectivism generally evolved around the theories of Marx. Marx, as we know, had lots of theories about things, and he adopted concepts and methods from Hegel. But what's interesting, though, is that Marx tried, ostensibly anyway, to inject a certain scientific rigor into his work, dialectical materialism and all that. That is, he tried to sort of reinfuse reason into a system of thought which had largely divorced itself from reason. And this factors in very importantly with regards to later developments. So eventually we come to World War II. Now, World War II had the effect of essentially destroying the moral credibility of right wing collectivist movements. Fascism, National Socialism, like the Nazis, these ideologies were basically discredited ethically because they were revealed to have produced overwhelming human rights violations. And of course, the Holocaust, just some of the worst atrocities ever seen in the history of humanity. So after World War II, right wing collectivism was pretty much done, at least in terms of large scale viability. I mean, there are still fascists out there, but they're generally fringe figures who don't get much traction so long as they openly avow such creeds. But that left wing collectivism, a la socialism, a la Marxism. And this is where the political element, which is palpable in the postmodernism of today, really comes into play. So, some of Marx's theories included the assertion that capitalism as a system was rife with internal contradictions, which would become increasingly pronounced as time wore on, hence the dialectic. Eventually, there would come a point where things broke down and the proletariat would rise up and seize the means of production and overthrow the order and institute socialism from the bottom up. However, that day didn't really come. The proletariat didn't revolt and seemed, as Vladimir Lenin himself wrote, to be incapable of doing anything more than unionization. So Marx's disciples, such as Lenin, such as Mao, who were itching for a revolution, decided, to hell with waiting around on the workers. Let's just kick things off ourselves. And so we get the Russian Communist Revolution, and so we get the Chinese Communist Revolution, which were implementations of socialism from the top down, which highlights something interesting, I think. Socialism is supposed to be a people's movement, and yet historically the figures who have spearheaded it have been characters who viewed the masses as being, in essence, too stupid to know what's best for them, and so taken charge of things themselves. There's kind of a superiority complex there that I would say is rather at odds with the actual tenets of the ideology. But anyway, with the adoption of Marxist policies in the early 20th century, many left wingers in the West saw beacons of hope. There was so much thought, so much hope in those days that the Soviet Union was going to be a shining light to the rest of the world, which showed the way forward into a brighter and more egalitarian future, that socialism would now show just how flawed and wrong capitalism actually is, and everybody else would want to jump on board. But yeah, things didn't really quite work out like that. It eventually became apparent that the Soviet Union was really a dictatorship, a totalitarian hellhole presided over by tyrants where millions of people were killed or otherwise disposed of. So even though people such as Jean-Paul Sartre, people like Eleanor Roosevelt, may have praised Stalin as some humanitarian hero leveling society for the little man, it eventually came out after the brutal suppression of the uprising in Hungary, as well as Khrushchev's admission that Stalin had been pretty much a monster. that socialism in Russia wasn't quite the sterling sinecure that a lot of people had wanted it to be. So that was off the table, so to speak. But hey, we still have China, right? Russia may have gotten it wrong, but China had to have gotten it right. I mean, they weren't quite as industrialized as the Russians had been, much more agrarian. So surely things turned out better there, right? No, not really. It didn't really work out there either. As it turns out, millions of people dead in China, gross human rights violations, the works. But hey, we still have Cuba, we still have Cambodia, we still have Nicaragua, but none of those really worked out much better. That's the thing. It failed across the board miserably, emphasis on miserably, time after time. And that's when the goalposts started to shift. The entire 20th century is basically just an extended series of shifted goalposts by the political left, from the initial shining beacons of hope, which were Russia and China, to the later cry of it's not real socialism, because that is, of course, the argument that you hear ad nauseum nowadays. It's not real socialism. Real socialism has never been tried. All the many leaders of all the many countries who have flown socialist banners were just pretenders, not the real thing. But the goalposts got shifted in more ways than just that. Another of Marx's predictions was that under capitalism, the middle class, the petit bourgeois, would shrink, and that the underclass, the proletariat, would grow, and that the upper class would also shrink, as well as capitalism ate itself through its own rabid avarice until what remained was essentially a pyramidally structured society of a few ruling monopolies on top and everybody else living in abject squalor below. But that didn't happen either. The upper class actually expanded under capitalism, the middle class fairly exploded under capitalism, and the underclass actually shrank. And as well, another of Marx's prophecies was that wages would eventually fall to below subsistence levels and that dire poverty would increase. But again, that didn't happen. Even the poorer members of society seem to be largely able to subsist functionally under capitalism. And so the left just shifted the goalpost again by redefining wealth from a positive to a negative. Okay, it's not now that capitalism failed, but rather that it succeeded too well. Amenities aren't everything. Now people are inundated with so many commodities and trinkets that we've been alienated from our deeper selves. We're all just soulless corporate puppets, slaves to our own hollow materialism, blah, blah, blah. But the point that Hicks is trying to make with this is that any reasonable person, emphasis on reasonable, would not hold to these views anymore because they've been so utterly discredited time and time again. And we're not just talking about numbers in a ledger book here, we're talking about millions of people's lives that were lost and ruined because of these gravely misguided ideas. As I said, the emphasis here is on reason because Marxism wore a veneer of scientific legitimacy, and people had believed going into the 20th century that reason would point the way to socialism. You can see this in like the Crystal Palace idea of Dostoevsky's day in Russia, the belief that science, that logic, that reason, that everything pointed towards socialism. That is, after all, what Notes from Underground is all about, pushing back against that kind of Crystal Palace thinking. But all these people, all these intellectuals thought that reason would vindicate their vision of the future, but it didn't. As it turned out, the opposite was actually the case. Capitalism flourished while socialism languished, but they didn't give it up, and they haven't given it up, and they won't give it up. And the reason why they won't give it up is because they do not care about the way that the world objectively is. All they care about is their own personal, subjective vision of how they think that world ought to be. And it all comes back to Kant, because again, if we cannot say as humans anything concrete about true reality, then it's fair game for anybody with an agenda to jump in and sell their own image to fill the void, which a lot of people did. And as the 20th century shows, a lot of people will kill other people who stand in the way of their vision. And so, after reason failed the left in the early 20th century, we come to the mid 20th century, where, like a jilted lover trying to spite their ex, certain of these thinkers just decided, well, if reason failed us, then screw reason. We finna burn this bitch down. And that's basically what they set out to do in France with philosophers, and I use that word rather loosely here, such as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Everybody knows that these people wrote some of the most obscure, indecipherable gobbledygook imaginable, throwing reason to the wind and arguing some frankly insane positions. And it's all kind of geared around tearing down the very concept of reason, of rationality, of objectivity. Truth no longer exists. Everything is subjective. And because everything is subjective, we can't judge anything. We can't make conclusive pronouncements. Facts mean nothing. It's all just relative to viewpoint. And because of this progressive divorce from reality, we come to where we are today, where the word woman is up in the air as to how it's defined, where if you ask some people how many genders there are, you're liable to get astronomical figures where it's now racist to punish crime at all. We have become so dementedly untethered from objective reality that we think that reality can be whatever we want it to be. And with this, we also see increasing collectivism now based around racial, sexual, and gender lines. It's not that you are you. Before you are you as an individual, you are a woman, you are a black person, you are a gay person, etc. You belong to any number of groups and communities before you belong to yourself. Your identity is not what you make it, it is made for you. Such are, again, the fruits of postmodernism. But now, as if this book wasn't a damning enough indictment of postmodernism in itself, we can always refer back to the SoCal affair of the late 90s. If you're not familiar with that, Alan Sokal was a physics instructor who submitted a paper to a scientific journal for publication, which was a hoax, but a hoax perpetrated with a liberal use of word salad and a vocal left-wing stance. And of course it was published, and of course it was showered with plaudits, because that's all it takes in the postmodern milieu. If you're appropriately left-wing and can use word salad adeptly, you can sell literally anything. Such, once more, are the fruits of postmodernism. So, yeah, that is Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks. It is, I think, a very, very astute book with a very incisive vision in tracing the history of postmodernism from as it is now all the way back to its roots. So, with that all being said, how do we fight postmodernism? Because it is most definitely something that desperately needs combating. So, how do we go about that? Well, we fight postmodernism um, by recognizing the world we live in for what it is, and by believing in ourselves as individuals having the ability to contend reasonably with that world. The world is how it is, and the harder you try to fight the way of the world, the more sorrows will ensue. God grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, the strength to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Postmodernists are postmodernists because they resent the way the world is, and they believe that by their belief alone, it can be different. They cannot stand anything that defies their vision. And this is why there is such an utter hatred of individuality, of independence, of greatness, of superiority, because these things resist control, which is what they want most at heart. Don't fall into that trap. You inhabit a world which is a certain way, but you are who you make yourself to be. Believe in the capacity for reason and don't be swayed by sophistry and demagoguery. So, yeah, Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks. I'm giving this book an A. There are perhaps some minor quibbles that I can raise with it. But overall, this book, I think, is once more inestimably valuable to the world of today because it really cuts to the quick, I think. And once again, I think it is very valuable and pertinent. And it is a strong recommend for me. If you have not read it, one of the strongest recommendations I've probably ever given on this channel. But if you have read it, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.